So fuck the streets and the system guarding elites with military police. Got people scared to speak. So tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. Nobody tell a better pain of glory. So tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. Better you than people finding out on more. So tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. Can't nobody tell a better pain of glory. So tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. Better you than people finding out on more. Tell your story, man.
All right, y'all. So happy Malcolm Wednesday. Welcome to our virtual artist storytelling. This evening we have Mr. Juston Cooper coming to share his story with us. So we thank all of you for tuning in. We thank you, Mr. Juston, for joining us on our platform this evening. Quick little disclaimer. The story shared out here on Malcolm, the questions, the views, the opinions, all of that do not represent Malcolm as a whole. So do not charge that to Malcolm, charge that to us individually. If we have any questions, we ask that you guys use one of the clap react or the hand raise reaction. Mr. Cooper, the show is your show. It's your floor. Go ahead and, tell us your story.
Already, peace, young kings and queens. You know what I mean? I love putting my Ashe energy into this moment with y'all. And it's an honor. I'm humbled to be here with y'all to share my story. You know what I mean? Which I judge is universal to a lot of our stories as melanated people. So, without further ado, I'm going to jump into it a little bit. I'm going to start with this. See, look, I dance to the sounds of sirens. Black and white slave ship pirates soliciting tyrants that practice injustice just because it's justice for incompetent substance for elite corruption. And that's just part of the job. Connecting metal that locks, not here but the block. Pray to the endangered species, to the hawks. Continue to fight or be fought. With the right to remain silent, I dance to the sounds of your sirens. Writing in the shadow of my words, echoes of crying souls unheard. Simply to fall to a plea, serving and protected in a society that does not include you or me. Where free only applies to coffee or donuts, or tight cuffs or long rides on a white bus just so they can come and visit us on the cusp of losing love. Sending pictures for admiring. See, I dance to the sounds of sirens and I'm on beat and in tune. From ancient sweeps of house nigga brooms, New Orleans City type blues, cats sweating me in places because I'm new. Shooting each other over red and blue and now we're shackled and chained and arrested. Suggested that we was threatening the falsehood of neighborhood protection, and that's why you drew your weapon with 41 times Paul Child's lies, reading articles that they write, and now I'm sorry, but we're not hiring. All because your criminal background says that you can't vote, lead, teach, or drive. Wait a minute. Let me see your registration, insurance, and driver's license. I stopped you because you was bobbing your head. Well, officer, that's because I was dancing to the sounds of your sirens. Coming up, peace. I'm a native, born and raised here in Denver, Colorado. I came out of that 80s and 90s era. And my story begins, I judge universally like a lot of our stories. I always say that there's 4 languages that all people speak. That's happiness, sadness, madness, right? And love. All of us speak those languages. And my story begins exactly like that. I was born and raised here in Denver, Colorado. Grew up in Northeast Montbello. So I'm a Montbello, Bellside, Montbello and through. But I came up at an era and a time, of course, that many of y'all may have heard about or read about, during the 80s and 90s, especially during the 80s, when the epidemic, the crack epidemic, social welfare epidemic was plaguing Black cities, Black people across the country, but more importantly, right here in our own backyard. So I grew up on the front side of Montbello, right? With one sister, my mother, my grandmother, who just recently transitioned, who was 108 years old, the oldest living woman in the state of Colorado, and the third in the country is who raised me. She was born in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1912. Well, along with 2 uncles, along with my mother, there was 6 of us that lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Albrook Apartments. Some of y'all who are familiar with the Northeast may, know what these places are. It's right on the front side of 47th and Peoria. But back when I was coming up, it was called the Albrook Apartments, right? And we were perceived, of course, in the Montbello area You know, you probably heard the nicknames that still stand to today as Mont Ghetto or any of those types of things, right? But I came up during that era, right, in a 2-bedroom apartment with 6 people. And I remember my first encounter with law enforcement. I was 7 years old, coming down the steps with a cap gun. And I had about 6 officers pull their pistols on me because they said that I fit the description of someone who was committing robberies in the apartments. I was 7 years old. Now, I didn't want to start my story with the frame around what's happening with the social justice issues, but the relevance to me seems imperative and important for this moment. That was my first encounter. I experienced and knew what it was like to not have a lot, to not come from a lot, and figure out how to survive, how to make it. But my grandmother was very, very intentional about giving me certain skill sets, understanding knowledge, to ensure that I would be sitting here in front of all of you sharing my story right now. And she gave me the basic life skills. See, right now, basic life skills is programs, right? You know, there's funding, there's programs for basic life skills, and people are getting taught that through different organizations. Well, I was taught that through my grandmother. From a very, very young age, she taught me how to cook. She taught me how to clean. She taught me how to iron. She taught me responsibility. I remember times that, of course, I couldn't go outside in the neighborhood and kick it on the corner with folks because my grandma wasn't having none of that. I highlight that because that level of discipline was inserted in me in a very early age. But like many of us, of course, growing up in Denver, in Northeast Montbello, right, I went to all the traditional DPS schools, right, and was kicked out of 3 of them, right? I was never that kind of, super thug or gangster type of dude, but I was just a little bit of a knucklehead, right? Just getting in and out of trouble, doing a little frivolous stuff. But I started off, going to all the old school. A lot of y'all wouldn't even know this, but in the front of Montbello, there was Oakland Elementary was like the first Oakland Elementary was in warehouses, right? So I went to all these schools. I went to Oakland Elementary. I was school hopping from Oakland Elementary to McGlone, from McGlone to MLK, then from MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School at that time to Montbello High School. So my story has that perspective of growing up in Denver, especially during the 80s and 90s, the influx and the experience that we were having around poverty, the experience that we were having around violence, all those things was an era in time that I came up in.
Excuse me if I can interrupt you for one second, JC.
Yeah, already, King.
We had a question from Tabitha.
Okay.
I have one after, and then whoever else.
Phil.
So my question is, what did you get put out of school for? Like, what were you expelled for?
Absolutely. Well, I actually was never expelled. I definitely was suspended and asked to switch schools. But at the time, it was because of really who I ran with. So we were just kind of really doing a little mannish things. At one point in time, I remember literally on the verge of getting expelled because a couple of partners of mine, we all came to school with BB guns. Right. And it was really, at that time, it's not like it is right now with the school to prison pipeline, but that was one of the reasons why I was suspended and almost expelled. The second reason why I often experienced a lot of issues at school, because I was the one that talked back. I would question the teachers. I would challenge the teachers. To me, you just couldn't pull the wool over my head. I was that kid. You know what I mean? And so I found myself challenging authority all the time, getting in trouble. My mama coming up into the school. Now the interesting thing about me was at the time, I actually would do my work, but I just didn't drink the Kool-Aid a lot of what I would hear. And so I would challenge the establishment. In fact, as a time I was a kid going through a religious journey, I had the same experience getting kicked out of churches and mosque, right? Because I was just one of those people that in school, you can't just tell me something, I believe it. And so that was partly due to that had a lot to do with me getting kicked out and going from school to school. And then another reason was just moving, right? Being able to survive at that time. My mother was a nurse, relatively speaking, worked at nights. Like I said, we were 6 people to a 2-bedroom apartment, didn't have a lot of money. And then when we had to move and couldn't afford to rent, we had to move. So I went from the Albrook apartments to the Lake apartments, from the Lake apartments back to the Albrook apartments to the new apartments that they built. And that constant movement had me going literally from school to school. And so those were 3 specific reasons as to why I would end up finding myself almost kicked out of school or suspended for certain stuff. There was some little fighting here and there, right? Especially with the crew that I ran with. We all had our little cliques, right? At that time, I wasn't heavy into the gang stuff, even though the gang stuff was all around me. Half of my family was from two of the most notorious gangs at the time in Denver, coming up in the 90s. So I found myself often associated or being coupled as affiliated with that. But when I was at school, it wasn't really that for me, because I also at the time was an athlete. I was a two-sport athlete all throughout my young time, Pop Warner, through high school and college. And so a lot of those things carried forth with me getting kicked out of school on a couple of occasions and suspended.
Okay. So you got suspended, and that was when your I don't know if you said you were raised by your parents or by your grandmother.
Primarily by my grandmother.
Okay, so your grandmother then sought that it would be a better option for you to move schools rather than to, thug it out where you were at.
Absolutely. My grandmother was one of those people that, coming from the South, and that, granted that, like I said, she lived to be 108. So at the time that I was young, she was easily in her 60s and 70s. So she didn't have that energy to do a lot of the advocacy and fighting that I believe parents need to do now, especially for their young people in the schools. So her immediate thing was just to take me out and put me somewhere else. And at the time, my mother worked nights, and then my stepfather actually was in prison, and he did 30 years in prison. And so in reference to that aspect of it, it was really just my grandmother there with me, my sister who's 4 years older, who had got heavily involved into the gang life at the time when I was a young person, to the point where I've experienced my house getting shot up, pistols pulled on me, put in my face. I couldn't tell you how many times, count on my fingers how many times I've been shot at, right? But a lot of that environment, my grandmother's thing was to not confront the school piece, and a lot of the stuff that was going on around me was just to move me. So then I would end up switching schools.
Okay, and where in the South was your grandmother from?
Shreveport, Louisiana, the Boot.
Okay, the Boot.
Yeah, born in 1912.
I feel it. Thank you for answering my questions. That's all I got for you right now. Mark Jonathan, Mr. Jonathan.
Thank you.
What it do, King?
Yes, sir. My question, well, I was gonna ask kind of what Tabitha said, but I was wondering, what was the result of your first experience with the police, where they I guess assumed your identity or said you looked like somebody?
Well, unfortunately, the result of that was nothing. My mother actually at the time when she heard everything came down the stairs, because we stayed on the second floor in the apartments, and really just, went off, started cussing out the police. And, I remember crying, I remember peeing on myself. I was that scared. I ain't that embarrassed to say, this is free form, right? We can do our thing, right? But from that, there was no results. There was no outcome. There was no follow-up. There was no apology. There was no anything. Right. And, the police were, they heavily, there was a heavy police force presence in the front side of Montbello at that time, especially in those apartments. Those apartments were plagued with, drugs, gangs, violence, et cetera. And so, unfortunately at that time in Montbello, it was considered normal. Right. And so it didn't really resonate with me as a young kid at the time, until my later formative years, when I experienced different police engagements that really started having me track, like, wow, I've experienced this type of brutality since I was 7 years old. How we doing so far?
Phil, you have a question?
Yes, indeed. Where was you at? What was you doing during the Summer of Violence?
Yes. During the Summer of Violence, 1992 and 93, right? Specifically 93. So during the Summer of Violence, that was actually my freshman year of high school. I was in Montbello. At that time, I lived kind of like what we call the backside of Montbello, which was over close to the high school, around Crown 56 in that area. And so during that time, the Summer of Violence for me, what I was doing, to answer your direct question, I was a freshman in high school, but I was also an athlete. I was a two-sport athlete where I played football and baseball. And so for me, that was really my kind of buffer between a lot of the things that happened during the summer of violence in Denver. But I too was at that time walking home, right, to Montbello. I had a lot of partners that was caught up in the summer of violence. My family was heavily involved in the gang life prior to the summer of violence, leading up to the summer of violence. I had family that was, in the traditional time at that time, the traditional gangs was Crips and Bloods at that time. And I had family on both sides. And so for me, I found myself during the summer of violence where I was at was caught in the middle of a lot of it. Just because of my family ties, because of the area that I lived in, a lot of the friends that I knew that had got caught up in it. So I found myself really literally in the middle of a lot of that during high school. And it's similar. I lost probably during the summer of violence, probably about 6 people within 2 months killed that I knew directly, 2 that I witnessed. And so, again, this is my freshman year of high school going into, my sophomore year of high school. And so for me, the buffer that really actually saved what I perceived saved my life at that time was A, sports, B, mentors, and C, my grandmother.
For those who don't know what the summer violence is, can you share with them what the summer violence is, please?
Absolutely. In Denver at the time, in 1993, Denver had, the city and county of Denver, the metro area, had experienced an extreme increase in gang violence, specifically to more violent crimes of assaults, murders, and really a increased frequency of gang presence. So you had multiple gangs that came into the city and county of Denver from various other states, California being one of them, Arizona being the other, Texas being the other, Oklahoma being one. Surprisingly, not a lot of people knew that. But for the first time, Denver had experienced in more of a public setting, actual gang violence, multiple shootings, drive-bys. The culture, the gang culture, especially coming from the West Coast, had really penetrated Denver. It wasn't that it didn't exist prior to the summer violence, but that particular summer, the media, the city and county at the time really put a spotlight on what was happening with gang culture in Denver. It had existed prior to 93, but it hadn't had a spotlight on it. People, the general public wasn't aware of, quote unquote, Denver having a gang problem until 93. And so it got coined by the media as the summer of violence. Now, the irony of that story, of that particular period in time in our city, is really drove a lot of what we're seeing today on how our city addresses violence and youth violence, right, at that time. But I think the irony of the summer of violence was that it had actually existed prior to 1993. But I think the politics of the city at that time was the first time that city and county of Denver had a elected official of color. Mayor Pena, Federico Pena, was the first Latino mayor in the city and county of Denver during the 90s. And so a lot of the political climate brought a lot of attention to the city having to respond to the growing gang violence that had been happening since 86, 87. And so that's what the summer of violence was coined as, and that's what it is. And at the time, young Black men like myself was literally caught in the trenches of the middle of it. There was heavy police suppression, oppression, kick doors, stop and frisk. A lot of y'all may have heard through your research or history classes or about New York stop and frisk policy, where they would just stop you for no reason at all. So a lot of those things were happening in 93 in Denver. In Denver, the city itself had never seen anything like that, to where you had police on every corner. They increased the police budget, hired more cops. The gang violence was in the media at that time every day, every time, every night. And keep in mind, young people, during the 90s, at that time, we didn't have social media. So you didn't have a Facebook, you didn't have a MySpace or MySpace. I just dated myself. Instagram, Snapchat. You didn't have any of that. We was in the early 90s. That's when the internet was actually just really booming, right? So we didn't have any of that. So everything you heard of was on the media. was on the news, and they just glorified, I mean, inundated, pushed out any shooting, any fight, anything of that nature that would happen, and coined it as the summer of violence in Denver.
Okay, so I had one quick question.
Yeah.
I'm jumping over.
Okay.
Okay. So my question is, so seeing somebody die or seeing a dead body, how did that change you and change your mentality? Because I feel like once you see someone die, it kind of shifts your psyche.
It does. It has a significant traumatic impact on the psyche of your brain. For me, post Summer of Violence in 1995, 2 years later, my best friend actually was killed in front of me. And so that particular incident really significantly shifted my life. The week after he was killed, I was sent to Arizona to live with an uncle because three things. One, at the time, the people who were involved were looking for me and other folks that were there at the time. We were in the wrong place. We was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Two, so that level of danger for me, my mother at that time made a decision that, you know, I had to leave. I had to get out of Denver. And at that time, I had never been out of Montbello in my life at that time. Right. So that was my first time leaving the state. The reason why I gave that context is because what it did to my psyche was it took me out of my comfort zone, took me away from home at 16 years old. I'd never been from home, never been away from my grandmother, never been away from my mother, my sister at that time. And now a week later, I'm dropped in Mesa, Arizona, which is what is called, it's a very Mormon-driven county. Mormon is a religion, all white county. It was the first time I experienced direct racism in my life, but that impacted my life significantly because I was uprooted from what I knew and dropped into something that was completely foreign to me with no support at all. The second way it impacts you is, of course, the grief and loss, right? It rewires the brain to literally operate in fight or flight. That level of a traumatic event, and I can speak to this now as an adult, of course, back then I did not know, had me at a constant state of a heightened state of alertness. I absolutely immediately became way more aggressive. I immediately became way more protective. I started carrying after that, which prior to that, I had never carried a firearm in my life. I started carrying after that. So it put me in a psychological mind frame of fight or flight. It immediately caused a ripple effect psychologically for me and emotionally in my relationships with other people. I immediately became very distrustful about anyone who was around me, who they were, where they was from. All of those things started to manifest themselves in me at 16 years old. And so when I returned back to Denver my junior year, and on top of also psychologically what it does is, for me, seeing that with it being my best friend immediately created the first time me experiencing real loss. I had experienced loss before. Like I said, during the Summer of Violence, I lost 5 friends. 2 of them was killed. That I saw the incident itself, but didn't see it happen to them and was around it, right? Between my freshman year of high school and senior year of high school, I probably lost about 15 people that I knew directly, that I was with the day before they was killed, right? And so what it did to me psychologically, when you see that and you're around that and you experience that, is it did really 2 things. It created in me a level of fear of others, but it also created in me a heightened level of aggression, right? A heightened level of alertness, and also sadness in my first time experiencing real grief. When I was sent to Arizona, I was out there literally the remainder of my sophomore year, which impacted my football career, impacted my baseball career. I was taken out of a lot of the student sports programs that I was in. And I remember the first 3 months that I was there, I cried every day. I had never cried that much in my life. I had experienced loss before in family and then the Summer of Violence, but I remember the first time experiencing what it really meant to just truly be sad and scared. As a grown man and an adult, I can have that honest conversation with you young people, right? And I remember wrestling with that when I was young because I wasn't a gangster, didn't really see myself as a thug, but I was from Montbello. So I definitely played some of the tough guy role. And I remember being the most vulnerable I had ever been in my life at that time. I can use this language now. I couldn't explain it back then. So I'm on a tangent a little bit, but to answer your question, young queen, psychologically, till this day, I still deal with that type of trauma. It still comes up for me as a grown man with two children, working in the field with a bachelor's and a master's degree, right? And so that long-term trauma doesn't go away. What that actually translates to is I still have a heightened sense of alertness, right, all the time. I'm constantly aware of my surroundings. I still have some mistrust, even though I've been in the working with probably some of the most hardest gangster killers, people that you could ever meet, I've worked with. But that is almost, unfortunately, that trauma is like riding a bike. It doesn't really leave you. And so, yeah, I'll stop there, but that's what it did to me psychologically. It definitely rewired my experience of community at that time.
Okay, so my question, as a man, growing up, it's kind of like a two-part question. Growing up, how were you, taught or influenced to deal with your emotions? And then now, after experiencing life and going through some things, being a man, you said you were a freshman in '93, so you're like, what, your early 40s?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. So,
yep.
Like, how do you deal with your emotions now as a grown man after experiencing life and stuff? And then what advice would you give to young men on how to deal with their emotions?
Well, how I deal with my emotions now is what I call emotional intelligence. I think this is going to be like probably a weird reference, but there was a line in one of Drake's songs when he said, being aware is better than being humble. Now, what I mean by that is that how I deal with my emotions now is first and foremost awareness. I think the thing that I would encourage young Black men to first start off when it comes to any emotion is one, being aware of the emotion. Often I think as young Black men, we're on autopilot. We're not aware of why we are feeling the way we are. We try to reconcile the feeling. We have to know that feeling emotion is natural, right? The universal God designed us to be emotional. It's part of our wiring. So how I deal with it, first and foremost, is the awareness of the emotion. The second way that I deal, and I call this emotional intelligence, which I didn't have back then, right? Most young men, especially African-American men, don't have this emotional intelligence. I was fortunate, I'm gonna go back to the latter part of your question. When I was young, growing up, how did I deal with emotions? One of the blessings that I had was having my grandmother. My grandmother was a very strong, straight to the point, blunt woman, but she was also very caring and really illustrated unconditional love. So my grandmother created a space for me to be emotional as a boy, right? Which was counterintuitive to what I felt, but she created that space for me. The other part of that is not having a father, growing up without a father. I didn't have that toxic masculinity taught to me in that way. It was literally the streets and the people that I was around that was giving me that example of how a man should not be emotional, or you're perceived this way if you are. So when I was younger, I had to wrestle with that. I did a lot of pretending when I was a kid. I did a lot of pretending to not be emotional because of the environment that I was around. But then my grandmother was for none of that. She would know immediately if I was sad, if I was happy, she would know. And my grandmother would talk to me. She would pull that out of me. She was also very stern with me. So when I was developing my emotional intelligence, I kind of had what I call this dichotomy, you guys. I had this both and. I had the streets and the people that I was running with. I was like, oh, you can't be weak. But then I had this loving grandmother that didn't play none of that and was like, boy, if you sad, you sad. Right. So I always I had this tug of war. And as I've gotten older now in my 40s, actually having children, right, I have a 20-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son, right, and watching how emotions work, I've established emotional intelligence. So the advice that I would give to young Black people, not even just Black men, but women too, young ladies, is Your awareness is important. Acceptance is vitally important. It is important to accept when you are sad. Stand in that space, be in that space. That's part of emotional intelligence, is being aware that there's a feeling, knowing what the feeling is, and accepting it. Now, what I'm saying, I don't want to sound philosophical. Let's just translate this in real terms. You pissed off, you're upset, you're mad. You know you're mad. You know you heated, you turned, right? The awareness is there. What I watch young, especially young Black men, struggle with is being okay with being mad. Usually they translate being mad to having to do something to get it out, to get it off, to not, but actually being okay. So those are the first two. The third thing I would say in emotional intelligence is being able to, with that emotion, discern or determine what's actually about it. So I call that fact versus fiction. So if I'm in an emotion called sad, I'm aware of it, I've accepted it. Now I got to discern what's actual fact about what happened and what's actual fiction. Most young people can't discern that. They have an opinion as actual fact. For example, if I say, you know what, Phil don't like me because I wear black shirts. Now, Phil ain't never said that to me. There's nothing back in that opinion. But from that, I can emotionally become distanced towards Phil. All of that is made up. So you have to have the ability to say, wait a minute, I just made that up. Phil's never told me that. So the third thing you have to do is be able to discern what's fact versus fiction with the emotion. Those would be three immediate things that I would share with young people and work with young people on how to deal with emotional intelligence, especially young Black men. The fourth and last but not least, once that discernment is there, is being able to determine what to do, if anything. Most people cannot sit in their emotion. Most people can't sit and just be sad and allow themselves to be sad without thinking it means something. Mm-hmm. So those are the four things. Now I feel like I'm on a tangent, but those are the four things that I would coach young people on as far as how to deal with emotions, how I deal with my emotions now as being in my 40s as a grown man, and how I actually interact with other people's emotions, because we're often not trained on how to do that either. If Sherry says to me, A, B, and C, my reaction to that emotion is very important on how our relationship develops. So those are things that I call emotional intelligence.
Thank you for that answer. That was a really dope answer, definitely much needed. So absolutely, thank you. Were there any other questions before we let Mr. Justin continue on with his story? Okay.
I had a question.
Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Catrielle.
Hey, Catrielle. Peace, peace.
Peace. So, earlier you mentioned that in '93 there was an increase in police presence and media coverage as a response to an increase in crime, is particularly in Denver. So, what I was wondering is, what do you think? What was the reason for that increase? Like, did it have anything to do with poverty, like a lack of jobs, or I remember you were saying something about like bad advocacy in the schools from parents and stuff. Like, what do you think is the cause for an increase in violence among us? Because I feel like police are going to police, but what was the reason? What was the reason?
Well, honestly, I would say, I think at that time, one of the biggest reasons was the influx of people moving to Denver, right? You had culture classes. You had people coming from LA. You had people coming from Texas, New Orleans, the boot. So you had these different microcosms of Black people who, Colorado and Denver at that time wasn't as, of course, advanced in the culture of gang culture than the West Coast was. So a lot of that came to Denver. And then also, I think what contributed to it too was you had local native Denver folks like myself that pushed back on that, right? Like we laid the stake in the ground saying, you know, no, this is our hood, this is our territory. Ain't no outside folks gonna come in. So you had that conflict brewing pretty heavily with folks from Denver and people coming into Denver with that culture that Denver wasn't really used to in that way. So that to me had a lot to do with the increase in the violence that occurred. The second thing to your point of around poverty, jobs, absolutely. Those things are all, those misnomers are always, to me, the underlying cause of some of the behavior that's experienced in our communities, right? Young people didn't have access to programs like you guys have now. In the 90s, outside of rec centers, recreational centers, there wasn't programs. In fact, the result of the summer of violence was a lot of the programs that you guys see now. The city's reaction to it was to put a lot of money into programs for young people like myself at that time. So that had a lot to do with it, is young people had nowhere to go. They had no outlet. They had none of that. If you wasn't in school and didn't have a, you know, wasn't a member, didn't have a rec center card, you had nowhere to go. The other thing, of course, was the introduction of drugs. You know, in the 90s, we were coming off of the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s. So you had a lot of absentee fathers in the 90s. They called us what we were called, at that time, we were called latchkey kids, right? Because your parents wasn't at home. You had the keys to the crib. You had home by yourself, period, all day until your parents got home. So there was a lot of gaps there because we were coming off of, and I'm saying coming off of, but it was still pretty prevalent, was the crack epidemic and the drug sales. So that hit our community really hard, which then increased the police presence and increased the heavy enforcement and the criminalization of our people, right? From distribution to possession to use, a lot of that. And then that also created a huge trafficking component to the city and county of Denver, because you had drugs, you had gang culture that had been on the rise, violence happening. So now Denver was encountering a culture that prior to, almost like a perfect storm, right? Denver had a little bit of gang stuff, but not anything big. Some drug stuff, but not really in the urban cities in that way. But between the crack, job loss, a lot of those things, I think, is why that summer specifically really highlighted what was happening in the city.
Okay, so I'm kind of making a connection here. So
already.
So if there's a lot of gang violence and like drugs and stuff, do you think that has anything to do, like, I don't know, you didn't mention, well, I think you did mention your father, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said that he was in jail for a really long time. So did you feel like, sorry, I'm reading off of my phone. Did you feel like the lack of your father's presence had any profound effect on your behavior in school? Like, because earlier you were saying you was like acting out in class and you didn't have even like an emotional guide to learning how to be a man. So do you feel like, I don't know for what, sorry.
No, that's actually a really good question. It's a very, very good question. Honestly, the absence, it's almost like if something is absent, you don't know what the impact would be. I can look back now and say yes, right? So I actually grew up without a father. My stepfather, who I mentioned, my mother actually married a man in prison when I was a kid. And so she married him while he was in prison. And the irony is he actually came home 2 years ago. And so when I was a kid, I used to go with my mother back and forth to Canyon City, to the prisons, to visit him for almost 4 years of my life, literally consistently every weekend. I give that context or that background to say it's a really great question, because I judge, like many of us who didn't grow up with fathers, always have that fantasy or wonder what it would have been like to have a father, and could it have impacted my experience in school, my behavior, what I perceived as being a man, etc. We psychologically, to the sister's earlier question of what does it do to the psyche, that thinking is always there when there's an absence or the gap of having a father. then for me, my reflection on it is now being a father, right? And having to make that up, right? And I have a 10-year-old son, right? So being a father, not knowing what it's like to have a father and what impact that would have had on my behavior is a really interesting dynamic for me now being a father and having to figure that out, right? So I know that was a long-winded way of answering your question, but did it have a direct impact on me as far as my schooling? I would say looking back, yes, I think so. I play a very active role in my children's education. I'm one of those parents that I'm up at the school, I'm hollering, I'm like, who we need to talk to, right? I'm that guy. So I often wonder if that would have been the case for me, would it have had an impact? So I'm definitely that one. Like they know me. they know me when I'm coming. They know. I plays none when it comes to my baby. So I do wonder what that would have been like, and do think that it would have had an impact.
That's really cool. Like, I think that's good to be involved, because my father, I didn't grow up with a mom. So having to like figure out how to be a woman on my own, that's a different story. But I basically went through my education without any advocacy. So I'm just glad that, I was able to make it to wherever I'm going. And, I just think that's really cool.
I tell you, looking back, my mom, I had one of those hood moms. So my mom would come to the school. My mom's coming to the school is a problem. Everybody catching something, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I had that mom, right? You know what I mean? I remember my sophomore year, my mother came up there, I got into a little fight or whatever, and they was talking about suspending me and expelling me and all that good one of stuff. My mom came up there with a 2x4. She literally walked from the house all the way up to the school with a 2x4. And that's when the schools just first started getting cameras. And I'm in the office, and I can see the camera. So I literally see my mama walking, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Up to the school with this 2x4 in the parking lot of Montbello, right? So, you know what I mean? I had that kind of mom, you know what I mean? Right? So it is interesting, but I highlight that to say having a parent that can advocate, and what I've learned, with my children now is so important. And it's often a gap. This is how a lot of young people get railroaded in the school system without having that advocacy. And, young women like yourself is resilient that you coming through that. You come through that, and you part of MACM and part of stuff like this that says, okay, I taught my daughter at a very, very early age to advocate for herself. And the number one way you advocate is you ask questions. You always trip them up when you ask questions. There's 3 specific questions you can jam any administration up on to really flush out what they're trying to do to you. 1, help me understand that. That's all I was, help me understand this. 2, walk me through why you are doing this. And 3, well, what do you want to have happen by doing this to me? I swear to you, young people, if you ask any administrator in any situation, from a job to school to, advocacy even, ask those 3 questions. When you make people explain, and it makes them question why they're doing what they're doing. So you keep advocating for yourself in school. Even when you get to college, same thing. I was on a 7-year track, right? So it took me 7 years to get my undergrad. I dropped out twice, right? Only to go back and get my master's, right? And even when I was told that I couldn't do it, I'll never forget, I took the whole GSAT and GMAT and all that to get into the master's program, and freaking bombed that, right? I'm like, you know what I mean? But at the same time, I go meet with the head of the department for my master's program, white woman. And she said to me, I want you to know that I'm bending over backwards doing you a favor to let you into this program. Whatever you do, I'm the one you don't disappoint. So I'll never forget when I graduated and walked across that stage, I went into her office and I literally looked at her and said, now you can stand up, and walked out. You know what I'm saying? So, you're always going to get met with those challenges, especially if you don't have someone there in your corner advocating, but you ask questions, you critically think, you push forward, right? Regardless, because their experience doesn't become your life story.
That was dope. That was everything. And then Ayana had a question. I want to make sure we get Ayana's question in.
So.
Hey, so I actually have 2 questions. Are you Are you a police officer?
I am not. No.
Okay. I thought I missed that. So, was there anywhere in your life thinking that if you become a police officer, it would less chance that you would it would be a less chance that those things will happen to you if you were a police officer?
That is a really, really great question because I know a lot of police officers personally that I grew up with that went to Montbello with me. So yes, at one point in time when I was a kid, I had the fantasy of becoming a police officer. The interesting point to your question is my son right now actually at one point in time wanted to be a police officer during this climate. To your point, or to your question of if becoming a police officer, if I would have, do I think that I would have had less experiences with police that most Black people have now? No, I don't. To answer your direct question, I do think that I know a lot of personal friends that are police officers and sheriffs that are Black that graduated from the same high school that I have, and yet they still experienced injustice with police, even being a police officer. They still experience discrimination. They still experience racial profiling. They still experience those things. What I will say, though, is I also know some of those folks that I grew up with when they became police officers and when come back to the community, they definitely had way more clout, right? They had more leverage with people. They were able to work with our people differently from other officers because they were from there. We knew them, right? They also had to deal with the fact that they had a badge on and the community not trusting them. So I think there's a couple of things that if you become a police officer, I'd never discourage our people from becoming police officers at all. In fact, more of us need to. We need to be able to control that narrative, right? But I don't think that it necessarily translates to making it easier in reference to having the Black experience in this country. But that is a great question, Ayana. I'm so glad that you asked that. I really like that question because it's complex. That's a very difficult question, but it's a really good one.
Thank you for answering my question.
Thank you for allowing me to. I sincerely appreciate that. How we doing so far? We doing okay, G?
We doing good. We doing good. We got about. Go ahead, Teraya. You got a question?
I feel a part two already. So
I feel a part two already too. I was gonna say we got about 10 minutes left, so if people got questions, we could use this time. But go ahead and let Teraya ask her question.
Already.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hi, Justin. So my question is, since you did give the story about, the incident that you went through when you were only 7 years old, and you said that you have a 10-year-old son, are you pretty open with him about, your experience and what's going on in the world so that he's aware as a young man? Or do you try to protect him from the things of the world?
Both. It's an and both for me. I am really open with him. Him and I, young people now, especially you guys, even his generation, with access to so much information, y'all already know what's going on. Like it's right there. So he's tracking. Like even at 10 years old, he is tracking. He's aware politically what's going on. He's aware racially what's going on. So I have no choice but to be open with him, to be honest with you. And my son's a Sagittarius. I don't know if y'all follow signs. But Sagittarius is they perceive.
Me too.
Look, they want to know. You know how y'all are. Y'all ain't gonna let up. Y'all want to know. You know what I mean? So to answer your direct question, I'm very open with my son in these conversations. I think it's important with him being a young Black man that I have to be. Simultaneously, I'm also protective, right? I do try to monitor how much I tell him and how much information he knows. Partly because of my own selfish reasons of wanting to protect his innocence. So I do a little bit of and both, but I'm more open than I am protective in that way. I'm absolutely physically protective and, mentally protective of him, especially when it comes to school, when it comes to any of those things. But I'm open with him about the color of his skin. Right now he's cute. He won't be cute when he's 14 in the eyes of a lot of people, right? I have that honest conversation with him. I feel it's my duty to, as a man, to make sure that he, be ready to stay ready.
I agree. Thank you for that answer. As a parent, I definitely agree with that answer.
Now, I would say the challenge for me was more my daughter than it has been my son. That's been the biggest challenge. I think in reverse, I was 23 years old when I was 22 when my daughter was born. And so in hindsight, I think I did way more protecting of her than being open with her. And it had an adverse effect, right? Because it's like a moth to a flame. When you try to keep young people from something, they want to see it more, right? And so I had that little bit of a learned experience with my daughter to be able to know a little bit what to do differently with my son. So, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I had a question. Okay. So, as you know, how old is your daughter?
20.
20. Oh, okay. She's in our age group.
I might know her.
Okay. So what, as a father, you have a 10-year gap between your kids, and I have that gap with my siblings. I'm 10 years older than my baby brother. I'm 20 years older than my baby sister. But that has nothing to do with my question. My question is, as a father, how do you bond with your children, and how do you keep your relationship positive and intact with them? Let them know that they could come to you for anything, whatever it is, no matter what it is, what's going on in the world. Your daughter, especially with dealing with boys, and just how do you as a father keep your connection and bond with your children so that they know, I can go to my dad, I could talk to my dad, I can trust my dad?
Well, I would say not well. I don't do it well. It's hit or miss. I'm just being fully transparent and honest with you guys. I'd be a lie to say, oh, I do these things and they work. In all honesty, it's been a learned experience. I think what I do, for lack of better explanation, is I am very consistent in my integrity of being here. Like, I made a commitment that no matter what, that I was going to be with my children. They know that. So one, they know that, God willing, outside of anything happening to me, Dad's going to be here. So that to me gives at least some latitude, especially knowing more with my daughter in her later former years than my son now. She was my biggest challenge, right? Because she was daddy's girl all the way up to about 13. And then it was a wrap. You know what I mean? But what I do now to maintain that bond is A, I make sure I'm available. B, I think that the integrity of them seeing who I am and what I do, and I've been consistent with that, creates a bond, especially with my daughter and my son, actually, no more than anything. They see Dad's work. They see my commitment to it. I mean, I spent 15 years working with juveniles and young people. And what I came to learn as a father is none of that work, none of my training, none of my certifications translates over to your own kids. It does not. So I created a bond with them by not being who I am at work with other young people. So that was a hard lesson learned, but it was a lesson well taken that created a stronger bond. The fourth thing I would say, that how I bond with my children, is they know that they can rely on me. That is important, right? And the fact that they can rely on me, I think, makes them come to me, versus if they didn't feel like they can rely on me, I don't think they would. I'll give you a perfect example, real-time example. This morning, my daughter actually works at Comitis. She's a frontline worker working at the shelter in Aurora. And they had a significant incident last night, and she usually doesn't get off until 12 at night. She came home and literally was crying with me to about 2 o'clock this morning because she was dealing with a client who was cutting themselves right in front of her. Right. And so she had a complete breakdown about it. This morning she was still in breakdown, but she had broke her phone because she was disrupting a fight that was happening at the shelter. That happened in real time just last night and today. So I was up to 3 o'clock this morning, woke right back up at 7 to hit the ground running. But she said to me, Dad, can you take me to get a new phone? Absolutely. The car ride there, she was able to really get off how she was feeling, what she was feeling, her grief, etc. I knew in that moment I'm available to her. Even though I had to work today, I moved a meeting to be available. So I think as a parent, it's really important that you make yourself available to your children, to build that bond. We may not have the answers, we may not know what to do all the time, but the fact that we're available in there, I think, is partly how I've helped create a bond with my children. And it wasn't always like that. When I was on the front lines doing the work in direct service, You know, when my daughter was young, I was working till 3 o'clock in the morning, working with homeless young people, kids in the system. You know, so it's one of I had to learn the importance of just being here, right? May not know what to do, but just being here is I think is probably the most essential part of bonding with your children.
I love your answer. Absolutely. That was dope. Thank you so much.
Right.
And then I know Phil had a question, and then I know Tabitha had a question. I don't know if I missed anybody. If I did, just hit your clap again and we'll make sure we get you. But go ahead, Phil.
Real fast, did you ever get locked up? You ever been to prison?
I've never been to prison. I have been to jail a couple of times. But I was fortunate to not experience going to prison. So I have been into jail for as a juvenile and as an adult for frivolous things. Only 2 things that were pretty major, but it was definitely a lesson learned. And the last time that I experienced jail, it was that moment where I was really clear that this is not where I belonged. It was literally that moment. Like, it's like the king in me, our ancestors in me said, this is not who you are. This is not where you belong. You're here to do more. And I made up my mind in that moment that that's not a place that I wanted to be and that I would work diligently to never go back there. So I have experience being in jail, but not prison.
That's what's up. Thank you.
That's right.
Tabitha?
Okay. My question, right? My question is this. So how close of a relationship do you have with your children? Oh, well, they're grown now, but when they were younger, you know what I'm saying? Like young. Like let's say high school.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm not in, your children's personal life. I don't know when they became sexually active or anything like that, but some people have that relationship with their parents where they could be like, well, I need birth control, or I need,
yeah,
the other methods, condom,
yeah,
stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So did you have that type of relationship with your kids?
I did with my daughter. I actually I grew up around like a lot of women, right? And so I had my grandmother, my mother, my sister's friends, right? And so it was a space for me as becoming a father that I was always comfortable with. And so I was that father that, still to this day, I'll go pick up, her female products, whatever she needs. And so I did have that relationship with my daughter to have those types of conversations. I think the irony of it was her growing into being okay with that. I think that, that's what threw her off usually in the beginning, was the fact that I was that way. I was open and honest about those conversations around, sex, her body as a woman, respecting her body. I did have a lot of those conversations because I was raised by my grandmother. My grandmother was a strong woman in that way that believed in, a man being able to honor, protect, and really serve a woman. And so I grew up in that ideology. And so I transferred that over when I had my daughter. Me and my daughter still are very close, right? She was a daddy's girl through and through, all the way, like I said, till she hit that teenage stage. But I always was open with her about those conversations. She knew she could come to me. I would have those with her. And then I worked in the field. So working with juveniles, especially, young women, I had developed a comfortability in those types of conversations, that I was naturally relatively trained in. So for me, it was easy for me to be available to my daughter in that way. Now my son, we not there yet. He's 10, but I see it coming. I see it coming pretty quickly, pretty soon. He's smelling himself a little bit. He that dude. So yeah, so I see it coming. But Tabitha, I'm hoping that answered your question.
Yes, and that kind of is a good segue into this next question. I know this is probably the last one that we're going to be able to take. But what role did their mother play in all this? And did your son have that same relationship? Because I've noticed you mention yourself as, being in that parenting role, but I'm kind of that piece of like that feminine mother piece. I haven't really heard too much about.
And that was actually, before you jump in, JC, that's a good segue to that's for part 2.
Oh, yeah.
That's for part 2.
Well, see, I think I've been fortunate in that way.
Good question. G, you want to follow up? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Her mother definitely plays a significant role. You know, so my wife and I, we were high school sweethearts. We've been together for 24 years, and so and married for 12. So she, you know, she's born and raised, came out of Montbello too, right? So very significant role. She's very close with both of our children, especially my son. You know that she is his world. You know, so we kind of had the traditional old school dichotomy of daddy's girl, mama's boy thing going.
Boy, all of that.
Yeah, but
know how that goes. You know, Mr. Juston Cooper. Thank you for joining us on our platform this evening, coming and share your story with us, being vulnerable and open with us. You know, it's much appreciated. You know, the stories run so much better when our guests are vulnerable with us and, you know, open book and can tell it all, the grit, the good, the dirty, all of it. I want to take this opportunity and invite you for a part 2.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir. We need you back. We need you back. Yes, yes. So at this time, we are going to show our gratitude towards you. I ask that everybody come off of mute. We are going to give Mr. Juston Cooper our phenomenal Malcolm 3 snaps. And here we go. Y'all ready? 1, 2, 3.
Oh, that sounded like it was in unison. Hold on.
That was good.
Yeah, that was nice. Yes, thank you, everybody. Y'all subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Facebook, multiple channels. Make a chess move, make a culture move, virtual artist storytelling, Macam Lingo, Macam Apparel. Get you some Macam Apparel. Get you some Macam Apparel if you want.
Okay.
I want a shirt, yo. Somebody put me on. I want one.
Hey, man, you heard him, Phil.
All right.
Okay. Look, y'all. So, you know, tune in to all of that. Watch out for everything that we're doing. Tomorrow we have another VASH show, same time, same place. But yeah, y'all. Thank you, Mr. Juston. Thank you to our guests and y'all. Mac them out there.
Mac them out there. Thank y'all.
Peace.
Bye.